G'day everybody, my name's Luke Whitington. I'm the Executive Officer of the Search Foundation. Tonight's event is asking the question, is mass unemployment and recession the only solution to inflation? First I want to say and acknowledge country, as we always do. We're meeting here on the lands of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander First Nations people all around the continent. We acknowledge that this land was taken without consent, without treaty, and without compensation. I'm up here in the Blue Mountains on the lands of the the Darug and Gundungurra people, where we say Warami Gamarata, welcome comrades, and Jim, of course, and the comrades there are on the lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. So we acknowledge elders past, present, and emerging of those First Nations, and acknowledge country as we always do. As I said, we've got Dr. Jim Stanford with us tonight to talk on is recession and mass unemployment the only solution to inflation. Dr. Jim Stanford is Economist and Director of the Centre for Future Work based at the Australia Institute. He has served as the director of the centre since its founding in 2016. Jim received his Ph.D. in economics from the New School for Social Research in New York. He also holds an M.Phil from Cambridge University and a BA Honours from the University of Calgary. For decades now, Jim has been demystifying and democratizing economic knowledge, providing the research and evidence to change policies that hurt working people and our environment. Jim is the author of Economics for Everyone, a short guide to the economics of capitalism. Second edition published by Pluto Books in 2015, which has been published in 6 languages now. He has written, edited or co-edited 5 other books and countless articles and reports in both peer-reviewed and popular outlets. Jim maintains an active presence on social media with his Twitter at Jimbo Stanford and Facebook Jimbo Stanford accounts. He's also an honorary professor of political economy at the Department of Economics at Sydney. We are very, very lucky to have Jim here tonight with us. Jim did a talk on the alternative to monetary austerity with Search last year, in August last year. I encourage everyone to check out the Search YouTube channel to see that video. I think it was part of the promotions for this event as well. During this event, Jim's going to speak for 20-25 minutes on this topic, and then we're going to have a Q&A. I'll run the Q&A. You can ask questions via the Q&A on the Zoom. And if anyone's in the room wants to ask a question of Jim, anything pops up from some of Jim's colleagues there, I suppose probably the best thing is just to indicate to Jim, and he can interrupt me and let you speak there in person. So without much further ado, we will be finished by about 7. So I want to get this cracking. I don't want to delay too much longer. I thank Jim for being there and thank everyone for joining us, and hand it over to Jim.
Luke, thank you very much, and thanks to all of the comrades at Search Foundation for inviting us to participate in your webinar tonight, and for your ongoing fight for economic and social justice on so many fronts. It's always a pleasure to do joint activities with Search, so thank you. The title of the webinar is obviously a rhetorical question. If you say, is recession and mass unemployment the only solution for inflation? Obviously, the answer is no. And we're going to map out, I think, a broader underlying narrative about what caused inflation in the first place, and then a more balanced and fairer and progressive response to inflation, and how to get it under control without sacrificing the lives and livelihoods and jobs and futures of hundreds of thousands of Australian workers. So I will share the screen here, and we'll run through some slides to make some of these points. And then I look forward to the questions and discussion afterwards. So inflation, recession, or both? Right now, chances are we could be both. Here is our website, futurework.org.au. I'll be referring to different work that our center has done on this topic over the last year, and it's all available open access there. And then my Twitter handle and the center's Twitter handle. I don't know why I bothered putting up the Twitter handle. Twitter will probably collapse by the time we finish this presentation tonight, thanks to Elon Musk and his machinations. What I'll try to cover in the time for our presentation, what's happening with inflation and what's coming next. Then the key question, who wins and who loses from inflation, the distributional battle that's underlying the rise in prices. I'll talk about how not to solve inflation, getting back to the rhetorical question that is the title of our talk today, what not to do, the looming risks of monetary austerity, and then talk about better, fairer strategies for managing inflation. So where are we at on inflation? What's coming next? Let's put this in the context of a short history of what's happened since COVID and the lockdowns. We obviously had an unprecedented situation. We had a situation where large swaths of the economy were literally shut down on purpose in order to protect human life. And so we had to stop going to work and we had to stop selling stuff to consumers on a face-to-face basis. So big parts of the economy were deliberately closed. And we had the fastest, steepest decline in GDP and employment in our history. We've never had a thing where so much of the economy was shut down all at once. And that bounced back pretty quick in terms of once the economy was reopened and we started getting vaccines and we started getting with the program around wearing masks and other prevention strategies, the economy reopened, but there was damage that lasted from disrupted supply chains, workers who had left and gone off to other jobs, logistical systems that were in disarray, including international trade and shipping, and other after effects, if you like, from the lockdowns. We did have a situation where the government, even the coalition government here, put out some major, important, necessary, sensible support to households through the expanded coronavirus supplement and through the JobKeeper subsidies to try and keep workers attached to jobs, even if they weren't needed. So on the upside, that meant people didn't lose their homes for the most part and have their lives completely turned upside down. They could sustain their family incomes with that extra support. However, that also meant there was a big pent-up consumer demand. For several months, people couldn't go out and buy the things you normally would buy. And they had purchasing power thanks to those supplements. That the supplements actually more than offset the total loss of employment income from the actual lockdowns. But there was nothing to buy until everything reopened. Then when it reopened, naturally we had a surge of pent-up demand. You also had other things happening, like the war in Ukraine and another big shock in global energy prices. Not directly because of the war in Ukraine. I'll tell you a surprising fact, they don't produce oil in Ukraine. So there was no direct reason why the price of oil should shoot up to 100 and some US dollars per barrel, other than the fact that we've allowed a speculative casino called the futures market to set the price of oil. And any shock in global supply and any shock in global confidence always causes the price to spike for a while, not for too long usually. So put all those things together and companies saw an opportunity and companies took advantage of that opportunity. They jacked up their prices to take advantage of the combination of short supply in many industries, pent-up consumer demand, the energy price shock, and all of the desperation and uncertainty that came after the lockdown. This was not the result of an unemployment rate that was too low. There's no evidence whatsoever that the inflation was spurred by labor costs and wage increases and a shortage of labor, not remotely. The unemployment rate is historically low, but we aren't even at full employment. There's hundreds of thousands of unemployed Australians. There's hundreds of thousands underemployed Australians. And there's probably 1 million Australians who say they'd like to work, but can't imagine how it would happen because of the lack of an adequate job and the supports they need to do it. So we are not remotely running out of workers. And wages have barely budged in nominal terms, and they're now falling quickly in real terms. So the problem did not start with workers, but workers are being singled out as the sacrificial lambs to solve the problem with higher interest rates and a deliberate economic slowdown. And the potential of that slipping, not just from a sort of deceleration of growth into an outright contraction, into an outright recession that would be worse than the disease. So this graph shows the sudden surge in inflation beginning in mid-2021. So we're kind of coming up to 2 years into this inflationary surge. And it has probably peaked. Inflation on a quarterly basis reached 7.8% in the December quarter. It was actually a little bit higher than that on a monthly basis. But already we're seeing it start to come down in January and February. And this is what's happening around the world as well, because those initial spurs to inflation after COVID are being repaired. The energy price shock is starting to dissipate. The supply chains are being fixed. The logistical problems are being ironed out. Inventories have been rebuilt. Global transportation and the backlog in shipping has been solved. So all of those core factors that got it going in the first place are being resolved, not because of interest rates, but because of time and trying to fix these things. And so inflation is coming down a lot in America, in Canada, a little bit in Europe, and it will start to come down. It will definitely come down in coming months in Australia. That hasn't stopped the RBA from slamming their foot on the brakes. And this is the graph that shows the dramatic increase in, this is the cash rate, the policy rate used by the Reserve Bank. This is not what you and I pay for in loans, mortgages, and car loans and so on. This is what banks pay to the RBA when they're borrowing money from the RBA. We all pay a lot more than that. And we've never seen an increase in interest rates this fast. Even in the bad old days of the 70s and the 80s, interest rates rose, but not this fast. And the impact on the economy, as I'll explain, of this drama is going to be very, very severe. What's going to happen now? The rate, as I say, has probably peaked as of the January. The ABS has started producing a monthly series on consumer prices. This is new, and they call it experimental, so they're not fully confident in it. But as of January, they think inflation has fallen to 7.4% year over year, and it will fall below 7% for February because of the decline in petrol and energy prices. But the overall problem, once we start the ball rolling with those kind of profit-driven supply shock price increases, then everyone else in the economy, other businesses and workers, of course, try to keep up. So we are seeing a broadening of inflation, and the rate impacts have had no impact on the underlying inflation at all. The only reason the headline rate has come down is because of energy prices. And the RBA expects that we'll see year-over-year inflation well above their target band. They say that they want to keep inflation at around 2 to 3%. That's their goal. They're going to be way above that goal for at least the next year and a half or more. The new element in this is what we've seen happen in the last 2 weeks with the outbreak of another crisis in the global financial system. And I'll talk about that in a bit more detail later. Not clear now how that will affect the central bank actions in America, in Europe, and elsewhere. America, the central bank on Wednesday increased their interest rate despite the banking crisis. And the RBA is doing it again. Their next meeting is the 4th of April. Hard to say whether they will keep, again, slamming on the brakes despite the banking crisis. I would guess that they will increase interest rates again. But we don't know for sure. And it depends also how much this problem in the banking system spreads elsewhere. Let's talk about the winners and losers of inflation. The fact is that in the race between prices and wages, prices have won by a country mile. So as of the December quarter, prices, the inflation for that quarter was 7.8%, more than twice the rate of growth in average nominal wages, 3.3%, according to the wage price index. There are other measures of wage growth that we can look at in the data. Average weekly earnings, for example, did a little bit better than the wage price index, in part because there's more people working full-time jobs over the last year. So that means your weekly earnings are doing better than your average hourly earnings. On the other hand, for workers who are governed by current collective agreements, they're still lagging way behind because most workers haven't had a chance to renegotiate those agreements in light of the acceleration of inflation. So a range of different measures, but every one of them says workers are losing out very, very painfully. For 2022 as a whole, for the calendar year as a whole, prices were 6.6% higher than they were the year before. For the necessities like housing, food, and energy that workers spend a greater proportion of their budget on, their prices rose more than 6.6%. Almost nobody, except CEOs, of course, got a 6.6% wage increase. CEOs, their median pay was up 16% last year. Gosh, what a surprise. So what we are seeing is an erosion in the real purchasing power of workers' wages, the real wage, that is how much you get paid relative to the cost of living. Real wages fell about 3.5% last year. It was worse for, say, workers in the public sector in many places where their wages were even slower. Their wage gains were even slower. And combined with the fact that public services are also being hampered, the crisis in Medicare, for example, this means the overall standard of living of workers is really in jeopardy right now. This graph is due to the work of my colleague, Greg Jericho, who's sitting with me here tonight at the MUA building in Sydney, showing how rapidly real wages have declined and in fact have erased 15 years of progress. Now, it was not a great 15 years. The period since the GFC has been marked by the slowest wage growth in history in Australia, so we weren't moving very quickly. And then it's been wiped out in the blink of an eye by the acceleration of inflation. So real wages are really back to where they were in 2009. And it's probably going to get worse for a while yet. It will probably be another year before consumer prices fall to a level where they're matched by the level of wage growth. And Australia's wage growth during this period has been relatively low, among the lowest of any industrialized countries. In other countries, for various reasons, wages have picked up a bit more, in part because of the tight labor market, in part because workers have had more success trying to adjust their wages to keep up with inflation. In Australia's case, for a range of reasons, largely the very repressive anti-worker nature of our labor and industrial relations system, wages have been among the weakest in the OECD. And the question is, beyond just the current crisis, how are we ever going to make up that gain? We've lost 15 years of very slow real wage progress. How would we regain that? To regain real wages, you'd have to have a period of several years where wages, nominal wages, consistently grew faster than inflation. And I can tell you what the Reserve Bank would do if they saw that happening. They would say, you know what? That can't happen. We've got to increase unemployment a little bit further in order to keep wages weak and get our inflation target met. And the fact that, Philip Lowe, the head of the Reserve Bank and his whole cohort are so aggressively blaming wages, labor costs, overheated labor market, even blaming the minimum wage increase for the poorest, lowest paid workers in the country for the problem, is a sign of what they would do if they saw workers trying to actually repair the damage that's already been done. And this is where it's really incumbent on the labor movement and progressives in politics to call out what's wrong with this story. Workers were not the source of inflation, we're the victims of inflation, and yet we're being blamed to pay for it. Contrary to the technocratic rhetoric that you hear from the monetary inflation targeters at the RBA and those who support that whole neoliberal regime, inflation is not just a kind of economy-wide problem that we all have to pull together to solve, not remotely. There's a distributional struggle underlying every inflationary episode in history, including this one. And a strange fact of life that seems to have been forgotten by the Reserve Bank, inflation is the increase in prices, and it's companies that set the dang prices. So why don't we ask about why companies have done so well? They have not just passed on higher costs, they have increased their profit margins to record levels. And we have published research, if you look on our website, called the Profit Price Spiral, that documents and quantifies the extent to which excess price increases by companies above and beyond their own costs, above and beyond the costs of higher imports, above and beyond wage costs, but actually increasing their profit margin is the dominant source of higher prices. In fact, by our reckoning, 69% of the increase in the overall economy-wide price level since the lockdowns, 69% was due to increases in unit profit costs. Now, this never gets talked about because nobody talks about profit as a cost. You don't learn it that way in economics, and you don't read about profit costs in the Fin Review. You read about labor costs. And the RBA publishes a big series on unit labor costs. They don't publish a series on unit profit costs, but they should, because it's become more and more and more important. Profits are higher as a share of GDP than they have ever been. So we are doing a public service at the Center for Future Work, inventing and publishing a new series on the unit profit cost. And this shows how it has changed, grown more than 3 times faster than unit labor costs in the period since the lockdowns. And this is absolutely the dominant cause of inflation. And it's the proof is in the pudding. Look what's happened to the profit share of GDP in Australia. Almost 30% of the overall economic pie that workers make now goes creamed off to the bosses in the form of profits. And that is about double what it was in the bad old days of the 1970s. So anyone who says we risk repeating the 1970s needs to take a look at this graph and say there is nothing remotely in common between today and the 1970s. After decades of neoliberalism, the economy has been turned upside down, and the profit share is night and day different, and profits are now the source of the inflation. We could even have a debate. I'm not going to accept that inflation in the 1970s was actually due to workers. We could have a good debate about that, but there is a lot more evidence on that score than there is today, where there's no evidence that the problem was due to the workers. Now, what's happened just since COVID hit, we've had another shift in the distribution of income nationally. So this shows whose share of the pie has gone up and whose share of the pie has gone down since COVID hit. And it is corporations, again, making a very significant improvement in their overall share of GDP. Workers have lost more. They had already lost. Their share of GDP was already low when COVID hit. We've been talking for years about the new record low for labor's share of GDP. And that was true even when the pandemic hit, but now it's really true. 45% of GDP goes to wages, salaries, superannuation contributions, and other forms of compensation, the lowest by far ever. Even the hard-pressed local barista running the cafe in their neighborhood, who we all feel sorry for because of how expensive it is and how hard it is to find workers. I shouldn't call them the barista. They're not the barista. The barista is the worker. The owner, the caferista, or whatever you call them, is done all right. They've managed to at least keep up with costs and then a little bit more. The share of small business income has actually grown a little bit, but it's the corporate share that has really, really grown and that no one wants to talk about. When we published our report on the profit price spiral, it got some good attention. There were right-wing economists just pulling their hair out. Their heads were exploding at the idea that somebody could argue that profits actually caused inflation and then actually measure it. And the AFR, which didn't cover our report when it came out, went and interviewed 4 right-wing economists to denounce our report 3 days later. So that's a sure sign that you're having an impact when the Fin Review feels that they have to run a story denouncing you when they didn't report what you said in the first place. Go figure. Okay, now we face this risk of monetary tightening, dramatic increases in interest rates, all driven by the assumption that inflation comes from the labor market and that there's a magic level of unemployment. Friedman called it the natural rate of unemployment. The technocrats after him called it the non-accelerating inflation rate of unemployment, or NIRU, but it's the same concept. Their idea is we must guide the economy back to that higher level of unemployment. What is it? I don't know. Ask Philip Lowe. 5% maybe? 6%? They used to think it was 8%. They can't find it because there's no such thing. That's the problem. But he wants unemployment higher. And their best case scenario is they guide the economy gradually through a soft landing to that magic level. Wages will flatten out some more. The real wage losses that have already been incurred will be cemented. They'll be permanent. And then we can carry on in some kind of tightly controlled neoliberal recovery. That's the best case scenario. That's not very appealing. The worst case scenario is they push us into an actual recession, comparable to the other recessions we had the last time we tried to disinflate the economy through rapid increase in interest rates, the early 80s and the early 90s, and for the same reasons. If history is a guide, you can't reduce the inflation rate by 5 or 6 percentage points without having a painful recession. Now, they think that they can do it, but we'll see. If we get the recession, then we see 200,000 to 300,000 job losses, or maybe more. And we see unemployment rising to 7 or 8%. We see hardship for 3 years or more. We see people's lives who are changed because their whole career trajectories are shifted down. And we know from past research that recessions have lasting scars on society and on people. I think this is a possibility. I think it's a significant possibility. Here's why. first of all, the growth that we were getting over the last year was 100% dependent on consumer spending. So this shows where the economic growth over the 12 months ending in the December quarter came from. And more than 100%, it's actually about 105% came from consumer spending. So despite the challenges, consumers were still increasing their spending in part to make up for the pandemic and what happened during the pandemic. The whole rest of the economy, considering foreign trade, considering business investment, considering housing investment, which is now shrinking, the whole rest of the economy had zero growth last year. It was all consumers. That was the only source of new growth. But look what's happening to consumer spending. It is flattening down very, very quickly because of higher interest rates, because of falling real wages, and now because of fear about the future. And when you are worried about the future, you don't go out and spend a bunch of money to get your basement fixed up or buy a new car or take a big trip. So consumer spending is now flattening or perhaps even falling. And the other thing to remember is because of the rise in interest rates, we're seeing households having to divert a massive share of their income in new interest payments to the banks. So this graph shows how much households pay to all their lenders in billions of dollars annualized, and it's about doubled since last March when the Reserve Bank started jacking up interest rates. And this is just to the December quarter, now almost $100 billion at an annual rate. That increase in interest rates is about 2.5% of GDP. So you're not spending it on stuff now, you're spending it to the bank, you're giving it to the bank. And that is a big amount. 2.5% of GDP is enough to single-handedly create the recession if consumer spending falls as a result of it, given there was no growth coming from anywhere else. The labor market itself is still kind of treading water. We've seen a slowdown in the overall trend. The numbers bounce around a bit month to month. December and January both had negative employment growth. February had a positive employment growth. Unlikely that that's going to carry on. So we're going to see some softening in the labor market. And now the new sort of grenade that's been thrown into the equation here is this signs of a global financial crisis that is also clearly a result of the increases in interest rates. What happens when interest rates shoot up is the price of bonds shoot down. It's a relationship because the resale value of bonds is not so appealing when you can get a higher rate of interest on new issues of bonds. So what you've seen is dramatic, the worst year ever actually in history for the bond market. It isn't because governments aren't going to pay back their loans. Governments are going to pay back their loans. It's more the speculative resale value of the piece of paper embodying that loan that is very, very volatile. And you've seen all kinds of financial institutions that depend on paper wealth in bond markets suddenly facing a dramatic problem because of the decline in bond prices. We saw the first sign, the canary in the coal mine was the near collapse of pension funds in the UK in September, many of which were about to collapse because of those bond market losses. The Bank of England bailed out the pension funds. Now, in the last couple of weeks, we've seen some bank failures, 4 in the US and then a big one in Switzerland, Credit Suisse, one of the biggest banks in the world, all because of the direct and indirect impacts of higher interest rates. And we're going to see more of this. We're going to see crypto funds collapse. We're going to see leveraged investment funds collapse. We're going to see emerging market foreign exchange collapse, all because of these different side effects and repercussions of higher interest rates. The governments are riding to the rescue for now. It's astounding how quick and generous they've been to retroactively change the rules and pay out hundreds of billions of dollars. And the leaders are up there saying, don't worry, we're well capitalized. We've got a handle on the situation, which is exactly what they said in 2008. You can go back and find the videos that show them saying this in 2008. And they're saying it because they're paid to say it. They really don't want people to panic because panic, of course, can bring everything down. What a great time to buy a bank, I'll tell you. Come out on the street corner down near Central Station and talk to someone about getting a cheap bank on the QT. UBS is the bigger Swiss bank that just got Credit Suisse. They got a new bank with $1.4 trillion in assets. They paid $4.5 billion, so a fraction of a penny for each dollar on the assets, and it wasn't even money. They paid in their own shares, so they basically printed their own money to buy Credit Suisse, and the government is going to guarantee a huge amount of losses. So there's a no risk proposition for UBS. And the central banks have pumped hundreds of billions of dollars into the company to give it some extra stability. And it's astounding. We are told by these same central banks, we have inflation because there's too much money out there. And workers have too much money, and we're going to take back some money from them by creating higher unemployment and suppressing wages. Too much money. Yet when banks are in trouble, what do? They pump hundreds of billions of dollars. The US Fed pumped $300 billion in new liquidity into the economy, into the banking system, not the economy, last week. At the same time as they're saying workers have too much money and that's the problem. An incredible need right now for progressive to show the contradictions of the private credit banking system. We've given private banks the license to create money. We just went through this in our two-day course, Luke, that we teach on behalf of the Australian Trade Union Institute for trade unionists. We've just finished another round of our course, and we went through how it is that private banks have the license to literally create money out of thin air every time they issue new loans by leveraging some initial starting amount of money, their own capital, or even government bonds, and leveraging it many times over. They changed the rules a little bit after the global financial crisis. They used to be able to leverage every dollar of their own capital 50 times over, and that was considered too unsafe. Now they can only leverage it 30 times over. So take the number of assets out there, loans and other investments that the banks have made, only 1/30 of it is actually there. So these things are not stable remotely. And this is why the leaders of the system are so desperate to keep people from panicking, because they know full well any sort of panic will bring many of them crumbling down. And we have to understand what's wrong with private banking. We have to understand the need to regulate them and hold them to account. And in fact, in some ways, replace them. We don't need private banks to create money. We can do it ourselves through public banks. And at the end of the day, after everything we went through after the GFC, and people said, well, we fixed the rules and it won't happen again, Janet Yellen stood up and said, she's got to be regretting this now. There will never be another financial crisis in my lifetime, she said. And of course, she's wrong. There will be several more financial crises in her lifetime, and she's pretty old. We have a situation where the dynamics of financial crisis are in the DNA of private credit banking because of the combination of the ability to create money out of thin air, the speculative impulse, the deregulation, and the failure to regulate this system so that credit is used to finance things that are useful, like job creation and building schools and other types of public service and infrastructure. Instead, we let these people go out and create money out of thin air to finance cryptocurrency bets and other speculative, useless things. Let me conclude. Thank you, everyone, for your attention. We need an economy that works for people. We need a better, fairer solution to inflation. I'm very proud of the ACTU and the paper that it put out late last year that mapped out an alternative macroeconomic vision for how to control inflation without mass unemployment and a recession. The 1980s recipe isn't working. We're already feeling a lot of pain from this monetary austerity, and we see no gain in terms of the impact on inflation. Inflation has come back down a little bit, and it will come down some more, and had nothing to do with higher interest rates. It was all the other factors that pushed up inflation up in the first place, and now are bringing it back down. We've got households that are suffering. We've got households paying $100 billion a year to the banks in interest. We've got a possible recession, and then we've got financial fractures around the world. So this is not tolerable. We can't tolerate the costs of this vision, and it isn't working anyway. Clearly, we need to find another way to control inflation. So what the ACTU has proposed and progressives around the world, you have to stop the initial impulse to inflation where companies can jack up their profits and spark inflation as a result. We need price controls and price caps. The governments are always willing to cap wages. Have you noticed that? They'll do that on the drop of a hat. We need to cap prices, especially in strategic sectors like housing and energy that feed into the whole economy. Where other companies are able to collect excess profits through inflation, we have to redistribute it, collect it back in the form of excess profit taxes, or taxes on share disbursements, share buybacks, excess dividends, etc., and then give that back in support for workers and low-income Australians. Particularly if we're facing a recession, we have to fix the job seeker system, which keeps people in absolute poverty. For the rest of workers, we have to protect their real incomes. And there's ways to do that without being inflationary. We could keep low unemployment. We could get unemployment even lower and not have a problem with inflation if we planned our labor market so that wages grew at a steady, reasonable, sustainable pace, reflecting a certain amount of inflation and the productivity growth that we generate over time through our skills and our effort. So you can have real wages that grow slowly and steadily. You can have very low unemployment and not worry about an inflationary outbreak by planning the labor market instead of using interest rates as a hammer to beat people over the head with. There's other things we can do as well by investing in energy, green energy, more affordable housing, fixing our transportation infrastructure to address those pinch points that's sort of caused the problem in the first place. One other last thing for us to worry about, as if we don't have enough to worry about, is the fiscal policy side. We've been focusing on monetary policy and higher interest rates, but we have a situation where governments are facing pressure and from the right and from the financial community and from their own ideology to cut back their own spending. And that would actually make things even worse. So we're watching carefully what the next Commonwealth budget is going to look like. The government initially, I think they were just trying to look like they're good economic managers and responsible fiscal custodians, et cetera, et cetera. They signaled that they were going to have a restraint budget this year. That would be a disaster. If we are heading into a recession and banks are collapsing around us and interest rates are super high, the last thing we need is government cutting back as well. That's like slamming the other foot on the brake, and that would be a problem. This was the forecast from the October budget, which they were boasting about almost no growth in real program spending. It was still falling this year because of the unwinding of some of the COVID programs, and then almost no growth in the years ahead. And we need more than this in the next budget. Our challenge right now, we have to have a new narrative about what inflation is and where it came from and show that it was corporate greed, not workers, that caused it. And we're doing our best at the Center for Future Work to make that case. We have to be stubborn as a working class movement to refuse to sacrifice our living standards to solve this problem that we didn't create. And every time a trade unionist sits down at the table and negotiates for wages that keep up with current inflation and make up for past losses, you are doing the right thing. You don't have to apologize for anything. We are going to need to table wage claims in the realm of the high single digits. 8-9% is where the math ends up when you look at what real wages have already fallen and where inflation is still at right now. And you aren't making the problem worse by demanding that. You are showing that we are going to protect ourselves and not be the sacrificial lambs. And then demand, if in fact we do go into a recession, a higher level of protection from government. At the end of the day, it is the workers who produce the value added, not the stock market traders and investment bankers and cryptocurrency libertarians. And if we end up in another situation of a recession and financial crisis and austerity, we have to first and foremost point the finger the other way. We didn't cause this crisis. And privileging work and workers and keeping people at work and getting them back to work and paying them fairly for their work is the way out of this mess. So Luke, I'll leave it at that. Thank you everyone for your attention. Whatever time we have left, let's have a good discussion. Thank you, Luke.
Thank you, Jim. That's a tour de force.
Oh, there's even applause from this audience here at the MUA in Sydney. They're even doing the wave. They're doing the wave.
I like it.
Around the border.
No, they should be applauded for their work so far. Before the audience came on, Jim alluded to the fact that the other economist, Jim Chalmers, the treasurer, actually referred to the Centre for Future Work's work on the fact that inflation has been caused by profits, not by wages. So you've already started changing the narrative there already. So congratulations to everyone around the table. I've got a question from Rose Reed, a comrade of ours. She should be able to come on and ask it herself if all the technology is all working. You there, Rose?
Yes, hopefully I am. Thank you, Jim. That was absolutely fabulous. So clear. I just had a question about these corporate profits, and if you're aware of where they come from. Is it an across-the-board issue, or are there particular sectors or segments of the corporates who are most responsible?
Oh, I'm so glad you asked that question, Rose. Thank you. The biggest chunk of it clearly has come from the energy industry. So think about the gas prices that people are paying, think about the petrol that people are paying, think about the electricity charges that have skyrocketed because of all those other forms of energy, and other profits, frankly, from the mining sector as well. So that is definitely the biggest chunk of it. Now, you hear this strange argument from the BCA and the other business lobby groups who try to discount the rise in profits by saying, oh, it's just the mining sector. So, this claim, it's just the mining sector, first of all, is a non sequitur on its own terms. What do you mean, just the mining sector? We have been told over the last generation that Australia should remake itself as a resource extraction and export nation. We should give up on manufacturing and all that other stuff and just focus on digging out the stuff under our feet. And so mining has been the centerpiece of this neoliberal vision. And mining has grown and grown and grown in terms of, mostly in terms of GDP, in terms of revenue, in terms of profits. The mining sector now accounts for a little bit over half of all the profits generated in the Australian economy, which is stunning. So to somehow say that this sector doesn't count is ridiculous. Of course, the mining profits are enormously important, but they aren't the only profits. And we have looked at the data, we've done the analysis, and it is absolutely the case that profits across the non-mining sectors of the economy have also grown faster than GDP, grown faster than wages. And even in the non-mining side of the economy, there's no doubt that the profit share has grown. And we can see that. What announcements have we heard in the last little while? Qantas, record-breaking profit, despite the lineups and chaos that we've seen in air travel, or perhaps because of the lineups and chaos that we've seen in air travel, because Qantas has deliberately suppressed supply by cutting back on flights so that they can soak travelers with higher prices for those seats that they do sell. Coles and Woolworths, record profits. They stand up and say, we're only passing on the higher costs that we have to incur for our own supplies. Bullshit, if that's all you were doing, your profits don't grow. I can show you the math. Okay, if all you're doing is passing on higher costs, your own profits wouldn't be at record levels. Same goes for the banks, of course. The banks are going to have record profits this year, in part because of all those interest payments that we're now directing to them and other sectors. It isn't across the board. You've looked, there's been an analysis in other places in America and Europe and Canada, and we'll do some here. The concentration of profits is in those kind of key sectors, those pressure point sectors, where companies were able to jack up the prices in the period after the pandemic. And they are the main sources of the higher profits and the main sources of the impulse of inflation. But it is not just a mining industry story. And this is a point we have to say loud and clear. I have a fear that we've lost our brave chairperson. We lost
everybody. Hopefully not.
No, everyone's still here. We got lots of participants. So I am going to nominate myself as chairperson. Oh wait, our brave chairperson, I think, is coming back or trying to come back. Yes, here's our brave chairperson. Welcome back, Luke. Thank you. We've answered Rose's question. We can go on to the next one.
Thank you, comrades. A bit of
I sort of felt like Alexander, what was his name? The defense secretary in the US when Reagan was shot? Alexander, anyone remember his name?
Oh, gosh.
The general, and then Reagan was shot and he jumped up and said, I'm in charge here. I'm in charge. That was how I felt when Luke disappeared. I'm in charge here. Even though he had no constitutional authority at all.
It was just Malcolm Turnbull's NBN here in the Blue Mountains.
Exactly.
The copper pits gave me a bit of
Tell me who it
trouble.
is. Find out.
We had a great question from Tim Diamond, but because of my disappearance there, I just went away for a second. But he asked a question about his experience in WA, where the WA state government actually gave people a credit for their energy for a time there, and they could use that until that credit ran out, and that had a positive impact on cost of living inflation effectively there. And he asked whether, and I think you alluded to this toward the end of your talk, which was, is it actually just government allowing prices to increase, which is the problem? You mentioned, caps on, cost increases. People have talked about rent caps. There's often, energy is a very big input, but that's got some other issues. If you, cap the price of petrol and so forth, or energy, people worry about the people overusing energy, especially fossil fuel-based energy. What are some of those things which, Tim's question was, is it government allowing this to happen more than simply corporations getting away with it? And what would be some of those options, do you think, for capping prices?
Oh, that's a great question. Thank you, Tim. And that experiment in WA was actually very successful. It eased the pain for energy consumers a bit. And it also reduced the consumer price index, the way that the subsidy was delivered. So there's various ways. The most effective way, frankly, would be to stop those dramatic price increases from happening in the first place. Now, I hear the point about energy conservation and shifting away from fossil fuels, and we have to continue to do that. But I don't think that jacking up the price of petrol to $2 and something per liter is necessarily the best way to try and achieve a climate goal. I think we have other more planned and systematic ways to achieve a climate goal, and the negative impacts of trying to do it that way are the very unfair impact of price rises per se, and then the fact that nobody knows how long those price rises are going to last, and quite rightly, they think prices will come back down. So they aren't very effective at motivating changes in technology or encouraging people to shift vehicles or whatever. A permanent increase in prices through something like carbon pricing would have a better impact than just saying, well, we'll hope that OPEC drives up the price far enough that people will think about conserving. I don't think that's an effective climate policy. So I think that we can imagine a fairer response. The best way would be to stop the price hikes in the first place through some kind of regulation on energy prices. And there's lots of energy prices we do regulate. We do regulate the distribution charges for both electricity and for natural gas. And there's lots of places in the world where the energy itself is regulated. And the Albo government, to its credit, has tried to do something like that with the price cap with limited application, but I think it helps. And it certainly got the business community squealing that we were returning to Soviet central planning, which is nonsense, of course. If you couldn't cap them, then you could find ways to try to ease the pain and relieve the distributional unfairness of it. And paying subsidies, particularly to low-income households for food, for housing, and for energy costs is a good way to do it. And lots of countries have been trying that in different ways. Ironically, you get the argument back from the conventional macroeconomists that if you do that, you're only going to make inflation worse. This is their standard knee-jerk line, because they are arguing that inflation results from too much money in workers' pockets. And if you helped out workers to deal with higher prices, you're only going to make the inflation worse. So this is where we need the counter narrative to explain where inflation actually came from. And no, helping out low-income households to deal with rising costs of some of those necessities is not going to make the problem worse. So there's, I think, a number of different ways to go at it. Stop the prices from rising in the first place. Use direct subsidies even into the pricing system itself to offset the price increase, or collect excess profits from the companies that have done so well and redistribute that to low-income and working-class households so that they can survive, in essence. The last one doesn't stop the rise in CPI itself. The first two would. The first two would short-circuit that rise in CPI itself. But in any event, they all would help workers to get through this period. Look, I have a member of the studio audience here who's raised their hand.
Oh, very
Can
good.
we take one?
Yes, please. I like that.
No, he didn't raise his hand. No, he was scratching his ear.
Oh.
For God's sake. You got to be careful.
We've got to get into
Careful with that.
the.
If you're at an auction and you do that,
That's
you could
right,
walk
we've got to
home
get
with
into
a $2 million Van Gogh.
Well, I was going to say the AFDNet dinner is coming up, so make sure you're at the AFDNet dinner, everybody. It's
Right.
very important.
And scratch your ear and buy something big.
That's right. Put your hand
Okay,
up.
sorry. Carry on, Luke. Carry on.
No worries.
I'm not in charge here.
there's-
What was the guy's name? Alexander what? Somebody has to
Haig.
Google. Haig,
Peter-
Alexander Haig. Thank you. It was
Peter
Alexander
Murphy
Haig.
has provided the historical
you.
context there. Well done, Peter. And he's also mentioned how the federal constitution doesn't allow us to control prices, which everyone who knows the history of Chipley in Australia, but states do have this power, as Peter pointed out, and as you so eloquently
right.
too.
Thank you.
So another question from WA, actually, Gil Chimbatete asks, how can we restructure the economy to remove the requirement for 3% or more unemployment? And in terms of also changing the narrative and going to your point about the need for increase for income support for non-working people, particularly those unemployed. People have rightly pointed out that if the economy demands that we have 5% unemployment, well, shouldn't we then look after those 5% better than we currently do? I think that's a well-made, rhetorical point around that. But yeah, Gil asks how, it's obviously a very big question, but how can we restructure the economy to remove the requirement for 3% unemployment?
Yeah, those are two really good points. Thank you very much, Gil. That last one, you've just cut to the utter hypocrisy of a system that deliberately maintains a quote unquote healthy cushion of unemployed people for the good of the system. They are saying that we need this much unemployment in order to keep inflation at bay, but we will blame and scapegoat and punish those unemployed people, even though they're performing a public service. And that is just an enormous hypocrisy. That we have to have unemployment, but we'll still blame the unemployed because they, didn't have the right resume, didn't do the right kind of interview tactics, didn't live in the right part of the country and should move somewhere else. So that is an absolute hypocrisy at the center of this Nauru narrative. And our colleague David Richardson actually published for the Center for Future Work a really good critique of that narrative for that very, very reason. Now, the key question looking forward is how can we get to lower unemployment than the so-called Nauru and keep it there without sparking inflation? And this, I think, is at the core of these so-called radical ideas that are in the ACTU's macro paper from last year. I will humbly say a paper that our center helped the ACTU to prepare. The key is, I think, going to have some kind of institutional regulation and planning in the labor market. So right now, for most people, wages are determined in a dog-eat-dog battle to the death between the boss and the worker, over who can get their way. And the unemployment rate affects that. And first of all, the battle is lopsided anyway. Workers are always fighting uphill against the employer because the employer has so much centralized power. And the worker needs the job in order to survive. The employer doesn't need any particular worker. So you're always fighting uphill, and a higher unemployment rate makes that hill even steeper because workers are more desperate and employers have more options at their disposal. So in a very weak way, you can expect that wages will pick up when unemployment falls. Now, that is a very weak relationship. We've seen the unemployment rate fall in Australia to relatively low rates, 3.5%. And wages went from 2% a year to maybe 3% a year. They didn't take off because employers, even in a tight labor market, still control the main rules of the game. So I, first of all, downplay the idea that there's a looming inflationary explosion if we get unemployment too low. But I do accept that in order to get to full employment, genuine full employment, and stay there, we're going to have a system that regulates wages in a stable and sustainable way. And I think that's going to involve sector-wide collective bargaining and economic planning in a way to say, look, over time, we've got a goal for average annual productivity growth. It might be 1%, it might be 1.5%. We've got an idea in our mind of how much inflation we can tolerate. Put those two together, and that's what you should expect average wages to grow at over time. And, it won't come down to a battle of brute force. It will be more a matter of planning to make sure that workers are getting the benefits of productivity growth in a way that can be sustained with very low unemployment. You could also use that kind of regulated, planned labor market arrangement to address issues like the gender pay gap, to provide particular premiums on wages for workers in very challenging jobs or in jobs where we don't have enough workers, like nurses and early childhood teachers, for example. So I think there's lots of ways that if we reconceive wages as a deliberate tool of economic planning and policy, rather than the outcome of a battle to the death between employers and workers at any point in time, that is ultimately key, I think, to finding a way to get very, very low unemployment and keep it.
I'll just editorialize a little here. Search has got our National Members Forum coming up in May 27 and 28 at the Teachers Federation in Sydney, and we've started having pre-meetings of members in various states in the South Australian, Northern Territory and WA meeting on early this week pointed out that if we can plan for 30 years of labour planning and to build subs, then why can't we do that for what you've just mentioned? If we're going to have long-term planning for workplace, workforce and labour plans effectively, that's something we should be able to take into other parts of the economy, not just for building submarines, nuclear submarines. We are getting quite close to the end of this webinar. I'm just wondering, we've got 13 questions there and quite a few in the chat as well. There's a question here from Jeff Evans, and it also is related to one from Rose Reed, which we might better sneak in before we let everyone go. Rose asks, who besides you, Jim, is promoting this case? And Jeff asks, given the media monopoly and the narrowcasting of social media, what has proved to be the most effective way of getting an alternative economic message out to the wider community? What can Search do? What can lefties do more generally to get this economic justice message out to the communities? What have you found to be the most effective at the Centre for Future Work? And what do you suggest the people on this webinar and our comrades more generally do to help you build this narrative?
Oh, well, thank you. Now, it isn't just me, first of all, and I'm going to show you that. I am joined here at the lovely MUA boardroom by three of my outstanding colleagues at the Centre for Future Work. And four, yeah. And I'm a Ph.D. economist. I can't even count. Okay, there we go. Here are four of my colleagues. Here's Greg Jericho, give a wave. And Eliza Littleton, give a wave. And Fiona McDonald, give a wave. And Charlie Joyce, give a wave. That is four, you're right. Oh my God. We're all working hard, including with our colleagues at the Australia Institute, to make some of these progressive arguments. And there are other, progressive analysts, economists, and labor law folks and others in Australia and around the world trying to push back at this idea that workers are to blame. So I feel in a way that we are part of a bigger movement, and I feel that we're winning in a way. Like I think the evidence is very strong, and people have made the case in powerful ways that, even as Luke mentioned, Jim Chalmers can actually stand up and say, no, I don't think wages are causing inflation. And that matters. That will matter, for example, to this year's national minimum wage decision. If the view that workers and wages are the problem became cemented, then they would be reluctant to do something good. Now it's going to be a fight to get a good decision out of the commission, and the inflation arguments are going to be front and center. But I kind of feel we're winning, and internationally, I think we're winning too. There's lots of people jumping on board. The Financial Times, not exactly a Bolshevik rag, had on the front page yesterday a whole feature about how U.S. profit margins are at record high levels, and that's the dominant cause of inflation. Exactly the same argument that we've been making. So how do you get the word out? You get it out any way you can. We've tried to get our word out into the mainstream media, and sometimes we succeed. But we also have to get the word out ourselves through our own newsletters and our website and our social media channels. So please follow all of those things, and please keep building alternative platforms like the Search Foundation, which plays a vital role in educating and mobilizing people for a better future. Thank you all for what you do.
Thank you, Jim. And I'm sorry to everyone, we couldn't get to all your questions, but as mentioned at the beginning, Jim is not an ivory tower academic. You can continue the conversation with him Jimbo Stanford on Twitter and on Facebook. And in fact, we're going to try and continue the conversation as much as we can at Search. There are some members of ours who are directly involved in a number of campaigns. I should mention Don Sutherland and the Living Incomes for Everyone campaign. Don's on this webinar. We can put you in touch with that campaign. We've also got the ongoing there's campaigns happening and action happening down in Victoria, in particular around income support and just general economic activity with our comrade Max Ogden, who we did a webinar with last year to launch his book, A Long View from the Left. So there's lots of activity all around the place, and if you want to get involved in any of that, simply just get in contact with me. I can put you in contact with those people. But for now, thank you so much, all of you, for being there. Particularly, of course, to Jim Stanford for tonight's webinar. We will post this on our YouTube so people can come back to it and see the slides and go through what Jim said. I encourage you to watch the previous talk that Jim did with us about the risks of monetary austerity. It was a great talk, and also covered some of the material here that I think they go together, these two webinars, as a really educative pair of talks. So please check that out, and we'll have this one up in not too long in the future. And yeah, thanks for being there, and we'll hope to see you again soon.